will be talking you today through our project, some of our key findings, and then we are hoping to have plenty of time for questions. So we will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for you to ask questions. You'll see in the chat details of how to ask questions. There's a Q&A function where you can ask questions throughout the event, and you can upvote your favorite questions, and Vicky will manage that in the background and make sure that the most popular questions get asked. If you want to tweet about the event, please feel free to tag us, and feel free to use the hashtag that I've created, Just Transition Bristol, which for some reason wasn't taken yet, so that's great. So please do tweet if you're partial to doing that. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about our project. So first of all, we want to say a big thank you to the Cabot Institute, who are also hosting the event, who funded this project for us through their innovation grants. So thank you very much. This project was inspired really by the One City climate strategy. So if you can remember a time before COVID in February 2020, Bristol launched its One City climate strategy, where it was committed to becoming a carbon neutral and climate resilient city by 2030. This was a huge leap forwards. At the time, it was 20 years ahead of national UK targets and seen as hugely ambitious. But what really caught our eye was the strategy calling for a fair and collaborative approach based on a just transition. So Alice and I are climate justice experts. We've worked on this for over a decade, both of us. And we know from studying climate policy at the global level that this kind of language is really rare. So it caught our attention, and we were thinking, well, what actually happens next after a city makes such a promise? What happens on the ground once such a declaration is made? And we wanted to focus in particular on decision-making processes. So once the city decides to pursue something, what happens next, and how are decisions made about how to implement an ambitious strategy that calls for a just transition? And in particular, we were really interested in non-state actors facilitating a just transition in Bristol. So by non-state actor, we mean people like businesses, NGOs, city boards, etc. So basically anyone who's not a governmental actor. We picked 6 Bristol-based non-state actors to engage with, either because we found their work really interesting or we had previous links with them. And we tried to get a kind of mix of public-facing projects, private industry projects, and NGO or community-based projects. We ended up with the Black and Green Ambassadors, the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, which both Alice and I sit on, the One City Environment Board, which was quite an obvious choice, but we wanted to contrast that with a different board. So we also observed the Economic Board, Livable Neighbourhoods Bristol, and Cycling Works Bristol. And then finally, ARUP, who are actually not a climate change organization, but played a key role in writing the One City plan. So we were really interested in talking to them about that. So I'll turn to Alice to give you a bit more details.
Thanks, Alex. So we went about the project conducting a series of interviews. We conducted 12 interviews, so 2 for each of the organisations who participated in the project. And we then observed over 9 hours of meetings for each of the organisations. And we collected a lot of data, over 65,000 words worth in interview data and over 9,000 words of observation data. We looked at not just the substantive issues that were being discussed, but also the decision-making processes in play, and thinking about key themes around climate justice, the One City climate strategy, and how they were being discussed and who was participating in those meetings. Essentially, this event is an opportunity for us to share our initial findings from our analysis of the data, but we really welcome any feedback or input from you, our audience. So do please use the question and answer chat function, and we'll address those questions and feedback in the end. Next slide, please. So first of all, to talk you through our observation methods. We observed, as I mentioned, 9 hours of meetings. The meetings themselves were a mixture of steering groups, city board committee meetings, as well as things like public-facing events and workshops. So there was a good mix of different types of meetings that we were observing. We didn't observe ARUP primarily because we wanted to focus specifically on their role in drafting the One City climate strategy rather than their meetings themselves. We noted who was in the room, so we looked at the attendees of meetings and then looked at who was participating. And we've broken down those observations based on our own assumptions around gender and whether those participants were white or non-white. We weren't collecting personal data from all of our participants. We looked also at whether they were talking about some of our core themes around climate justice, the just transition, and the One City climate strategy. We conducted all of these observations online because of the COVID risks. So we took our notes down by hand and then typed those up to thematically code them. So just to talk you very briefly through our thematic coding. I won't go into lots of detail because it's quite dry, but if you have questions about our themes or sub-themes, or you're really interested in something specific, do please feel free to pop a question in the Q&A and we'll try and get to that at the end. So we had 4 key themes, the first of which is procedural climate justice, looking at things like participation in decision-making, information, access to justice. The second, we looked at just transition. So what do we mean by just transition? How is it being defined? Vulnerability, climate vulnerability. So in terms of groups impacted by climate change, but also groups who may be impacted by the transition itself, by climate policy. And then inclusion and exclusion of particular groups. We thirdly looked at the One City climate strategy, how that was being interpreted, any components or impact of that, and finally any emerging narratives, so things such as the impact of COVID. I'll pass on to Alex to discuss some of the findings.
Thanks, Alice. So I'd like to start with procedural justice, first of all. So one of the things that I found really interesting in terms of who was in the room is that there was a really good gender split. Men and women were pretty much equally represented, with women being slightly more represented, which kind of is in line with the population in Bristol. However, and this might not surprise any of the women in the room, men dominated the discussions despite more women being in the room. So men spoke 65% of the time and women spoke 35% of the time. So that's just in terms of how many times people spoke, but I also found that men tended to speak for longer than women. As Alice said, we tried to break down who was in the room by our own assumptions of who was white and not white. And as you can see here, attendance at meetings was quite evenly split between white men and white women. But then it drops down significantly when you start looking at non-white women and non-white men in the room. And I should add that this particular slide includes the one black and green meeting we were able to attend due to scheduling conflicts. And if I took that out, it would skew the data even further. So the number of non-white women speaking drops down to 6, and the number of non-white men speaking drops down to 1. So without that black and green work going on in the city, this would look even more unequal, which is a very problematic finding we made. People speaking in meetings by race and gender, again, this does include the black and green event, and it's actually even worse without it. White men spoke 285 times, white women 149, so about half as much, non-white women 11 times, and non-white men 6 times. So this is in over 9 hours of observations of meetings, to give you a sense of how much time this encompasses. And then the final thing to note about who was in the room is that meetings are most often chaired by white males, followed by white women. There was one non-white male chair in the black and green meeting and no non-white female chairs at all. So it's not just about who's speaking and who's in the room, it's also who's controlling the conversation. Obviously, chairs are not there to strictly control who speaks and who doesn't, but they do have an influence. So I think if we had some more diversity in who's chairing meetings, this might help a little bit. What I also found, and what Alice found when we were watching these meetings, is that most meetings are procedurally inclusive. What that means is that there's a mixture of how to kind of make your opinions known. So there was things like voting in meetings, document sharing, and even emailing to make decisions if you weren't able to be present at the meeting in the first place. But we did find that men were interrupting women and speaking over them, and generally speaking more often and for longer, like I showed you in the graphs in the previous slides. We also found that maybe a Zoom phenomenon, but women tend to use the chat function more than men. But this is not always checked or kind of commented on by the chair. And what's interesting is that women actually take their time here and really write detailed comments and quite long comments often, but these are not always engaged with in the same way that comments made out loud. The other thing to note is that the sense that the climate change movement is dominated by white people was actually discussed at some of the events and meetings. So there was definitely self-awareness. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we discuss our interview findings, but it's definitely noticed and seen as important by participants. The other thing to note, obviously, is there was a stark lack of diversity with only one event by Black and Green having multiple non-white people both present and speaking, which was quite shocking as a climate justice scholar living in a very progressive city and in a very progressive climate change space. And something else that happened that was really interesting is that at one meeting, the only non-white person present was asked to specifically feed back on how to engage non-white communities, something they clearly felt uncomfortable doing. And this came up in the interviews as well. And the quote here is from one of those participants saying, "The diversity within diversity is often overlooked." So basically, people are being asked to represent huge swathes of communities as if they were some homogenous group within which everyone knew each other. And that is very uncomfortable for the person who's asked to do that. I should say, because I want to say positive things as well, the meetings had diversity in other ways in terms of sectors, of areas of work and expertise. So we had people from all sorts of sectors in the cities. There were different jobs like academics, engineers, etc. present. But yes, very much a white space. Another thing I wanted to touch on was what was discussed in meetings. So we tried to count the number of times these topics were discussed. So again, within 9 hours, climate change, climate justice, just transition, and the One City Plan. So you can see the discussion of justice not coming up overtly very often. And I should note that the Environment Board actually discussed the One City Plan the most. They mentioned it 10 times. So they really skewed this graph. And that's probably not surprising considering they kind of feel ownership of having to execute the One City Climate Plan, but still really interesting. There was no mention at all of access to information or access to justice in any of the meetings we took part in. So even though we planned to code for those, we couldn't find them. And climate justice, like you saw in the graph before, wasn't mentioned explicitly in any meeting except a Black and Green meeting where it was flagged as being part of their mission and part of their work. So that was quite interesting. Another thing to note is that vulnerable groups and climate vulnerability were not mentioned very often and only by half the meetings or half the actors in the meetings that we observed. And then there was a kind of common theme when the One City climate strategy was being discussed, which was that people weren't sure how it would happen. So for example, one thing that came up was fitting enough heat pumps to meet net zero targets or upskilling enough people to implement changes to energy systems. This came through in our interviews as well, and we will discuss that more in a moment. Okay, then finally for the observations, some emerging things we found, general observations. I should say there was a real spirit of community and common purpose in every meeting we attended. The audience, however, was difficult to keep engaged. I'm sure you noticed this yourself after a year on Zoom. It's really hard to keep people engaged online, and often they're doing things in the background. Just so you know, it's quite obvious when you're doing that for someone watching you, but it's also completely understandable. There was also a sense in the room, most rooms we were in, that it was really hard to act on climate change. So for example, I watched the airport presenting their net zero plans in one of the meetings and saying very casually that they weren't including scope 3 emissions targets, which accounts for about 95% of their emissions. And this was like a source of frustration in that meeting. And this came up in a few observations, the difficulty of making real change. There was also the sense that COVID might have stalled progress and made things more difficult. For example, the use of public transportation is down. There's less community engagement possible at all because you can't see people face to face, and people are busy, for example, with homeschooling or childcare. And then finally, it wasn't quite clear what role some organizations were playing in terms of critical engagement. So what I mean by that is systemic change and really making radical decisions. So often there seemed to be no space or time to be critical of existing positions, narratives, or to challenge existing structures. And this airport presentation is one of those examples where someone came to present plans, but there was no real room to be quite critical and ask really radical questions. So I wasn't quite sure what the role of that organization really was in that moment. Let's now turn to interviews.
Thanks. So I'll talk us through briefly our interviewing methods and then some of the key findings around procedural justice. So we conducted 12 interviews, as I mentioned, 2 for each of the participating organisations from the public, private and civil society sectors. Usually that was with the chair or with the lead for that particular organisation in their work around climate justice or climate change. We used a semi-structured style, so essentially that meant that we went in with some core themes and questions around those themes that we were looking for example, around climate justice, just transition and the One City climate strategy. But then we were also led by the participants themselves. So we were open to new themes, emerging narratives, and asking follow-up questions where new topics arose organically, letting the interviewee lead us in different directions. And that gleaned some really interesting findings as well. All of our interviews, again, were conducted online over Zoom, and we recorded the audio, transcribed them so that we could then code and analyse them. So to just briefly talk you through our analysis, again, I won't go into lots of detail just for reasons of time, because I'm sure you're more interested in the findings. But we looked at procedural climate justice, so the 3 key categories around decision-making on climate change, information, and access to justice. We looked at just transition, the understanding and definition of that, any particular focus on vulnerability, and inclusion or exclusion of particular groups. We looked at the One City climate strategy, its role, components, and impact, and finally emerging narratives, and that included, for example, the impacts of COVID and the importance of non-state actors. So, moving on to some of our key findings from the interview data. Looking at procedural justice, we focused here primarily on decision-making and participation in decision-making. We found that the degree of influence over decision-making on climate change varied a great deal between different actors that we spoke to. And it was particularly stark when looking at civil society groups and the way in which their decision-making processes were structured. They were far less hierarchical. If there was a chair, the chair perhaps wasn't taking such a commanding role, and there was far more encouragement for all participants to speak and given opportunities to do so, and really encouraged to do so, and perhaps with breakout rooms and sub group discussions and so on. Secondly, the structure and dynamics of some of the local governance meetings could be a bit exclusionary. So as Alex already discussed with respect to the observation findings, we did find that male dominance of discussions was a theme that came through in the interview data as well. And also this issue around a lack of time. So perhaps the structure of meetings being quite rigid and having a lot of points to get through, and that there was a lack of time to critique existing standpoints. And that was something that was observed with our interviews as well. However, the involvement of private sector actors was found to be very significant, and that was something that was reinforced by some of our participants in having a key influence over policy and decision making. But that is kind of balanced against perhaps reputational concerns around being seen as getting involved in lobbying groups who may be directly trying to influence policymakers. So there's sort of a willingness to participate and actually wielding a lot of decision-making influence and power, but perhaps being reticent to get involved in some sort of specific campaigning organizations, for example. In terms of information and access to justice, again, slightly more neglected as themes within procedural climate justice, but there were some important observations and findings that came from our interview data. Firstly, the city boards can play a really important role in disseminating relevant information on climate change to specific stakeholders and making that information accessible and relevant to those specific stakeholders. So that's a really important finding. However, we need to be careful about the manner in which information is being presented. And some participants observed, for example, that language around this really matters. So we shouldn't be saying that we're going to educate organisations about climate change, because that's actually quite patronising. What we should be doing is engaging their expertise, engaging them in conversations and winning hearts and minds to re-engage that interest. There was also a need generally for greater overall understanding of the impacts of climate change, carbon consequences, as we've termed them here, and also around resilience. What are our resilience needs and what does resilience look like? So perhaps the need for more access to relevant information around those two themes. Finally, access to justice. It wasn't really engaged with very much. And when we talk about access to justice in the climate context, we're thinking about things like reparation for climate loss and damage, maybe groups who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And there wasn't much discussion of that, but there was a really interesting finding, which actually challenges this notion of justice and access to justice. In that, a participant observed that traditional notions of justice could be quite unhelpful and exclusionary, that particularly notions of justice involving punishment may not be helpful in this context and may have the effect of alienating specific actors from engaging. So that was really interesting.
So I'll turn now to some findings on just transition in particular. The first thing I should say, which really surprised me in a good way, was that there was a really comprehensive understanding of climate justice and just transition by most participants. I've been working on climate justice for over a decade, and let me tell you, this was not always the case. It seems to me very recent shift in the kind of public consciousness, understanding what climate justice means and the importance of it, especially with the Greta and school strikes and XR phenomenon going on. So really interesting to see there was a real grasp on the issue. However, some participants found debates around justice unhelpful. So some of our interviewees, for example, said it was getting people's backs up to talk about justice or even dividing people. So this is something to stay aware of when you are trying to ensure a just transition. It's not something that everyone finds helpful. And sometimes they even say, you know, it could be condescending or confusing to use it, or it divides people. So something to keep an eye on as just transition is taking hold in Bristol. The importance of active listening was recognized by a lot of our interviewees when we talked about just transition. So an example here is a quote: "You don't know what justice or fairness looks like to somebody else unless you ask what their green future looks like." So basically there was an awareness that although in the interviews we were talking about our perceptions of justice, these were seen to be not kind of universal. So the participants understood the importance of listening to other people and saying, you know, it means this to me, but it might mean something else to somebody who's not me, or who is in a different class or race than I am. The other thing we noted from the interviews is that protecting the vulnerable is seen as really important, but that resilience and kind of adapting to climate change isn't spoken about enough in Bristol. So the kind of focus might be on just transition in terms of lowering emissions and creating green jobs, but this idea of adapting to climate change and getting ready is not being taken seriously enough. And I'm hopeful that this might change due to the tragic circumstances of the last few weeks, for example, with an extreme heat wave in the UK followed by flooding over just the last few days. You know, as we start to feel the effects of climate change, this might be written into policy a bit more. There's also a kind of strange perceived divide between rich and poor. So one of our participants said, "Where are the working class people at climate protests? If Greta had come to Hartlepool, no one would have turned up." So there's this perception that climate justice as a pursuit is very middle class, and that, you know, poor people in Bristol don't care or don't have time to care. However, something that relates to this, and I found really interesting, is a discussion about harmful narratives around non-white communities in Bristol. So this was a discussion with one of our non-white interviewees who said, there's a lot of cultural erasure of contributions that Black and Brown communities have made to the environment and how that looks. So what we were talking about here in this conversation is the idea that Black and Brown communities don't care about the environment or aren't involved, and that this is actually really harmful and not true. So one of the examples that was given was that the vegan diet is very popular all of a sudden in Bristol and very trendy, but actually there's communities in Bristol who have been following the ETOL diet for decades, which is a vegan diet, and that it wasn't celebrated until white people started doing it. So I wonder whether this divide between rich and poor might be a little bit harmful as well. Assuming that working class people don't care about climate change is quite condescending and might be harmful. The other thing to note is that even though there was an awareness that the space was white and that marginalized communities were not being included enough, there was a struggle to try to connect with marginalized communities for participants, even if they were aware and they found it important. So by that, I mean poor communities, non-white communities, disabled communities, or even older generations. The participants were kind of facing a battle almost like of how to include and a confusion around how that's done well. And then finally, there was this issue of tokenism. So one of the participants said, I often feel slightly uncomfortable if I'm the person speaking after the speaker on behalf of all these communities. So in this conversation, we were drawing on the idea that one non-white person was being asked to represent everyone non-white in Bristol, as if they were some sort of homogenous group, which was unfair on the person in the room, but also just kind of sweeping all the people from the non-white communities into the same drawer, which isn't reality. In terms of the One City climate strategy, there was a common theme in our interviews. The strategy is seen as so ambitious, but there's no real sense of how to achieve the targets. So one person said, yeah, that's great, but there's about 15 steps between here and there, and none of that is mapped out, and some of the deadlines are a bit skew-whiff. So I had to Google skew-whiff because I'm not British. It means askew, but I think what they were trying to say is that there's all these ambitions set up, but nobody's really sure how to get there. And it's also not clear who owns the strategy and who's responsible for carrying it out. So one person said, it feels like kind of nobody maybe has ownership to make people do it and keep people on track. So although the strategy has been written and the Environment Board certainly engages with it a lot and is trying to implement it, it's not quite clear what it means for the rest of the city and who's responsible for it. However, it was noted that Bristol is in a place of transition and that key steps to achieving the strategy have not yet been set out. So emphasis on yet, there was a kind of hope that it would happen, but it hasn't quite happened yet. Some members of the climate community were obviously frustrated by this, but most expressed hope. And then the final point to make is that what came up in our conversations is that the writing of the plan included the usual suspects and was therefore quite exclusionary. So community groups and marginalized groups weren't consulted enough and maybe therefore don't tend to engage with it in their everyday practice. I'll turn back to Alice now to talk us through emerging narratives.
Thanks, Alex. So some of the emerging narratives that came through quite strongly in our interview data included difficulties in taking climate action broadly, so specific difficulties and challenges, as well as the impacts of COVID, and also the significance and importance of the role of sub-state actors. And I'll talk about that final point, the significance and the role of sub-state actors, when we move on to best practice shortly. But just to touch on some of the challenges and impacts from COVID. There was a lot of discussion around capacity and the allocation of financial resources. And what I mean by that is the status quo of financial resource allocation, how resources are being allocated to specific policy areas. And there were big question marks arising over, for example, the implementation of large-scale infrastructure projects. How are we going to get from A to B in order to meet some of these really ambitious climate targets, perhaps around transport and so on? Where are those financial resources coming from? There were also points around institutional capacity and human resources. So do existing institutions have expertise in climate change? Do they have staff time and availability to perhaps train existing staff? And to make that a reality is actually quite a significant task. So that was quite interesting, just as I guess a reality check on some of the strategic goals. There were also questions around the distribution of power and political power, which were quite interesting. So how is the power distributed between national government, regional government, and local government actors, and how can they affect change? So do, for example, members of Bristol City Council have the requisite decision-making power and financial resources at their fingertips in order to make some of these large-scale changes around transport, housing, and so on? Or is that power distributed regionally around the southwest, or perhaps rest at the national level? There were, as a result of COVID, inevitably fewer opportunities for face-to-face engagement. So those conversations that we might have had over coffee around committee meetings or steering groups or other organisational meetings, where ideas and new campaigning strategies, for example, may have been engaged with. But there were also some positives. So although engaging new actors was challenging, perhaps bringing in new organisations was also challenging. Actually, COVID has enabled us to challenge business as usual. So looking at our working models, for example, we've been able to encourage more remote working, online working. The way that we commute has been challenged. So there are far more people, for example, walking and cycling than there were before. And all of these things are things that could carry forwards into sustainability initiatives and to the realisation of the One City Climate Strategy goals. And there was an interesting observation from one of our participants as well around relationship building. So we might have assumed that COVID has perhaps damaged relationship building because we have less face-to-face interaction, but actually some of the online meetings were more convenient, more highly attended, more regular, more frequent, and that has had a positive relationship on perhaps some of the committees that existed previously. So to give some examples of best practice, it's always nice to end on a positive note. The Citizens' Assembly is something that came up from a few of our participants actually, as a really good example of a way to engage the wider public and a wider range of individuals on environmental issues. It was also a really good opportunity for sub-state actors themselves to present ideas, get some participation or feedback on their plans and strategies moving forwards. So that is something that we could continue, strengthen, and perhaps also see more power, decision-making power delegated to, if we can extend that to have a broader remit and to be more inclusive. There, broader participation from civil society actors is a really important point as well, and the inclusion of minority groups in city governance, in things like steering groups, committees, and that type of inclusion needs to be really strengthened. It is something that many of the groups are already attempting to do, and that might help to address some of the limitations that we discussed with respect to the observation findings in terms of the diversity of participation in some of the city governance going on. Further engagement with private sector actors is also an important point. So they have the capacity to really drive significant policy change, and a number of our participants observed that the role of business is really significant. They're playing a big role in the local economy, and as such they wield significant policy influence and decision-making power. So finding ways in which we can extend that net further and engage with more private sector actors is a really good way to do that moving forward. Finally, City Council members being in touch with the needs of local communities, that was a strong positive that came through our interview data, is that City Council is actually far better placed to be in touch with those needs, to know the community needs on the ground. But what we need to do is ensure that there is continuing engagement with communities. It's not just a case of these council members are directly elected and that's where representation ends. There should be ongoing true engagement, perhaps not just consultation and surveys, but active participation and ongoing accountability as well. So, as Alex mentioned as well, Black and Green were really significant as an example of best practice because their meetings were really inclusive. There were some very inclusive public-facing events which we were able to observe, and there everybody's opinion was significant. There were lots of opportunities to participate in various discussions around sub-themes and so on. And there was a real sense of community among the ambassadors themselves, as well as with the people they're engaging with. There's also a sense that Bristol is really committed as a city to just transition. And just transition was widely engaged with amongst all of our participants, widely engaged with in committee meetings. So that's really important, and that's a really positive thing. If we can break down what just transition looks like and make it more inclusive and participatory. Bristol's also really justifiably seen as a leader because of the One City climate strategy and its ambition. So we've just got a quote here. One participant observed that they think it's better than what I've seen from other places. It's more grounded in understanding of the sorts of conditions that need to be created rather than the technology that needs to be fitted or subbed out. So it's this notion that Bristol as a city is really in touch with this. It's just a case of hammering out what the One City climate strategy goals mean in practice. So going forward, what are we intending to do with our research? Essentially, we'd like to inform the development of more just and inclusive climate policy responses, as well as empower and lift the voices of more climate vulnerable groups in our society. And that's not just groups who are more vulnerable to climate change impact, but also groups in the just transition who may be disproportionately affected by climate policy itself, by mitigation measures and adaptation measures being implemented. We're going to release a full policy brief, and that's due in September, but we'd really like to include any insights or feedback from today, so do please let us know what you found most interesting and useful, and any critique that you have. We're also going to produce an academic paper, and this we're going to have under review by the end of the year. So do let us know also if we can have additional impact. We'd be very happy to come and present this work at your organisations or institutions. If this is something you think would be useful, do please get in touch with us via email, via the Cabot Institute. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
And if we don't get to you, please feel free to email me directly at alix.dietzel@bristol.ac.uk, or get in touch on Twitter or through the Cabot Institute. We're hoping to get to as many questions as possible, but we are aware, that we only have about 20 minutes for a very big topic.
Thanks, Alex and Alice. We have lots of questions that have come in, so I think you're right, we might not be able to get through all of them, but we'll see how we get on. So the first question actually is focused about the language of climate justice itself, and says there appears to be divisiveness about using language like climate justice to point people to the point that people and organisations do not want to use this phrase in strategies, etc. How can we overcome this so that it does not get in the way of galvanising the support and timely action we all need to take?
It's probably important to understand where the hesitation comes from and to ask questions and approach with curiosity rather than to simply say, oh, you're just not with the times, or you don't understand, or to be condescending. Like Alice said, one of our participants told us, don't try to educate people about it, try to win hearts and minds. So I would say being curious about why. The two people who told us it was problematic had totally different reasons. One said it created conflict. Another said, they didn't quite understand how it was helpful in terms of bringing people together, because justice means different things to different people. So I think a sense of curiosity and listening is very, very important. And I can see why it can be divisive. Alice, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to reinforce, really, as you said, that climate justice is such a huge concept, and actually Alix and I have been studying it for quite some years now, and we would both probably approach it in different ways and have different definitions of climate justice. And that's a very personal thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think you're right in sort of, we should try and unpick those definitions of climate justice. What do we mean by it? And emphasize that it is such a broad church, you know, it brings in so many different views and different approaches. And some people, for example, focus on a global injustice of perhaps developing states and being disproportionately affected. Others may focus on, you know, local vulnerabilities of specific groups or exclusion of specific groups. And, you know, all of those perspectives are completely valid. So I think it's important to emphasize that there is that breadth in terms of the definition of climate justice.
Thank you. I think more of a comment than a question, but I think reflects on some of the points you made about the One City board. So it says, if you're not on a One City board, it's very hard to feel connected to the process or even take it seriously. The danger is the creation of an elite group of people making decisions without any opposition or challenge from outside. One City is an assumption in itself. I don't know if you have any reflections or comments in response to that.
Really good point, and certainly something that came up. You know, as I said, the Environment Board were referring to the One City plan most often and mentioned it 10 times out of the 14 we saw overall. So certainly, yes, huge engagement by them on the One City plan, much less so for community groups and, you know, people who were working outside of that immediate framework. So yes, we should be aware that the One City plan isn't inclusive in the sense of how it was written or how it's being executed, and to be very aware of that. And this space for critical voice is really important. Even among, you know, those elites that are sitting together making these decisions, there's almost no room for critical engagement, even if there's a critical person in the room. That came through really strongly in our interviews. So trying to decide as a city, how do we make space for critical interventions, and how do we give people the time and space to do that, where they feel brave and they feel like they can be included. And I think Black and Green did that really well. And I hate to harp on about them constantly, but they're great. I'm not sponsored by them, I swear. They were great. You know, they constantly said, you're valued here in the room. We want to hear from you. There were breakout rooms to allow for discussion. There were facilitators there to listen and to feedback so that people, you know, didn't have to take on that themselves. So I think that's really important. And I think, Alice, you said you found the citizens' assemblies were really important for that as well, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is about participation in that process. Because of time constraints, capacity constraints, the timeline of local governance, essentially, I think the willingness is there to engage, but actually there was a lot of pressure to come up with a strategy in quite a short period of time. But what is really important now is that when we start fleshing out how we're going to reach some of these key goals, and that's an ongoing, very much an ongoing process in breaking that down into sub-targets, that we do attempt to engage much more fully with a diverse range of communities from Bristol as we flesh out what that means in specific areas of policy, for example, around housing or around transport. How is that going to affect communities, and make sure that vulnerabilities are taken into account as well in that consultative process. And I think that will help to address some of those concerns.
And we've got another comment here which sort of follows up on your mention about engagement via citizens' assemblies. It says, if no significant policy change comes from the citizens' assembly, what does this say about how seriously we as a city take inclusion of marginalised groups and communities?
So the question is sort of critiquing the inclusiveness of the citizens' assembly itself, if I've understood correctly.
If you don't act on what comes from those assemblies, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think that's something that we need to see taken up much more strongly. And there was discussion of further delegation of decision-making power to the Citizens' Assembly and to community groups, which I thought was really significant. In terms of procedural climate justice as well, that's something that's really important if we're going to fulfill the need to have a broad-based participation in climate decision-making. We do need to actively delegate that decision-making power. And you know, fleshing out what that looks like in terms of balancing institutional needs to be able to make decisions versus having that delegated power. But I think it's important that there is a paper trail and there is clear evidence that those concerns that are flagged in the Citizens' Assembly are being taken seriously. They are being incorporated into decision making, and that citizens see that happening. And if it's not happening, that they can challenge decision makers and ask why it's not happening. That they have challenged that ability to challenge, if you like, so channels through which they can question and interrogate decisions that have been made on their behalf. And as it's so significant in terms of climate justice, because we do have these vulnerabilities to take into account, and we know that existing decision-making panels and boards are not diverse enough.
Thanks. A new question now. So firstly, very interesting and useful findings. Given we're in a process of transition in many senses, and so can't expect to shift immediately from how we are to how we want to be, do Alix and Alice feel that these findings are different, or more specifically better, than they might have been a few years back? Do you have a sense of progress? And if so, what are the green shoots of change you're spotting, and what's needed to encourage them further? So a few different parts to that question, but start with what's different and better.
Thank you, first of all, for saying the findings were interesting and useful. That's awesome. Great. The green shoots for me and the kind of things I didn't expect, I suppose, kind of linked together. So the thing I mentioned about this change in the vernacular around climate justice and the awareness of it and the awareness of the importance, it's huge. Honestly, before 2018, nobody ever asked me to come talk about climate justice anywhere. And then all of a sudden, I was at the Met office, and I was at the Cabot annual lecture, and I was here and there, and people wanted to know, what is this all about? And I think that is a huge change. And there is a real sense that people want a just transition, and they want to do it well, and that they want to do better. So that is a green shoot for me, and an unexpected finding, a good finding. I think the kind of hurdles for me are the real lack of participation from people who aren't white and middle class. It's not a shocking finding at all. We know this is a problem, and it's often brought up. I guess the good thing is that there's an awareness around it, and there is at least a discussion of how people might do better, even if there's confusion and like not good practice at the moment. There's this sense that it's not okay. That's really good. And I think certainly with last year's events, around the Black Lives Matters protests and Colston being torn down from his statue, and like all this radical kind of discussion around race, that I think has really helped. And then, initiatives like Black and Green, they're not the only ones, but really pushing that idea that we need those voices in the room, and that it's important. That was a really good finding as well. Alice?
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think it's also really encouraging to see how mainstream these discussions around climate change have become. Perhaps we're not all talking about specific aspects of climate justice, but there's certainly undertones of that, and there's certainly a lot of discussion of just transition. And the way in which climate change has been mainstreamed into discussions in different policy sectors, across the public sector, the private sector, civil society. It did used to be the case more so that civil society actors were sort of shouting from the sidelines saying we need to really act on climate change and climate justice, and campaigning and lobbying. But actually they've been very much more included in that process now. And we're seeing it coming from the private sector, from businesses. It's being integrated into business strategies. It's being mainstreamed across different policy sectors, not pigeonholed into, let's just have one environmental person or a small group of environmental people within this body who are responsible for that. It's different policy areas that you see it being discussed in. And I think that's really important, because we do need that broad-based action if we're going to meet any of these really ambitious goals. So I think that's a real positive take from this. But yes, we do need to be much better in terms of diversity and community participation.
And so actually a question looking at it in a slightly different way, because you've been talking about improving sort of diversity and inclusion. There's a question here saying, how can we best engage the affluent communities in the UK on the issue of climate justice and a just transition, as many of these communities see it as something they agree with in principle, but it's of little direct relevance to themselves or their towns?
Yeah, this is something that comes up at the global level as well. You know, there's a very small percentage of people who are responsible for over half of the world's emissions. You know, we're talking about people who fly frequently and buy luxury goods and eat a lot of meat and own big houses that they air condition and several cars and all that stuff. So we have to be very aware that there are differentiated responsibilities among individuals, and that those, you know, who are having higher emissions and consume more and also have more money to help the climate change cause need to be held responsible. That's something that, you know, I work on in my own work on the kind of distributive side of climate change justice, which is like who should do what and why. And something that came up in some of our interviews too, there was actually a quote, I had to take several things out of the slides because our practice run was way too long. But we did find that, you know, one person mentioned, we have to be honest in Bristol, we are an affluent city. There are several people living in this city who are very, very rich and have high consumption, and they need to be held to account. And we have to be honest about that and not make people, you know, the average person feel awful about their emissions and their climate change actions, when really there's people who are very powerful who could be doing a lot more. So that's what I would say.
Could I just add to that as well? I would say also it's about facilitating change. So decision makers, national government, local government can help facilitate those changes and make them appealing. It shouldn't just be something that is viewed as negative, as moving to a low carbon or zero carbon future. And actually there are huge opportunities involved as well. If we look at, you know, new technologies, emerging technologies, different practices around work, different lifestyle choices, there can be huge benefits, health benefits, for example, of shifting some of the way business as usual models, if you like, for our everyday lives. And I think it's about highlighting that, that helps to bring people on board as well. So it's not just something that's seen as a negative, well, this is going to affect my quality of life. Actually, in many ways, it could improve quality of life for people across the board, and that includes the affluent.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you will have an answer to this question, but I'm just going to ask anyway. Are there any comparable stats for Bristol's neighbourhood partnership meetings? I remember them as more diverse than the data presented here. I'm not sure if that's something you'd be able to comment on, or know who might have that data. No. Maybe that's something we can follow up with afterwards. So. Next question, what would you define as green jobs, and have you thought about environmental vulnerability?
Of course, we've thought about environmental vulnerability. It has come up in a lot of the conversations as well. You know, we framed it more in terms of like resilience today. And like we said, in a lot of the meetings, vulnerable groups weren't discussed in much detail. So that's why there was a lack of emphasis on that in the slides today. In terms of green jobs, you know, it's things like transitioning away from fossil fuels in most cases. So an example we gave today was heat pumps, you know, phasing out gas boilers. That is going to be a massive task to do that. So we definitely need to skill up people to be able to actually replace those systems, because I live in a brand new home, and although we have solar panels and, you know, an electric charge point and all this stuff, we still have a gas boiler, which like blows my mind. So yes, that's a kind of an example of a green job. But yeah, for me, it's all around like transitioning away from the dependence on fossil fuels. Alice, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree. And I think framing it also around resilience opportunities and climate adaptation as well. So I think there's a lot of focus on climate mitigation, on, you know, green energy, for example, which is great, and there's a lot of subsidies available for that type of innovation, but also encouraging innovation around adaptation and resilience. We need to create more jobs around that as well. So how are we going to support communities to become more resilient on the ground? You know, how are we going to adapt to the health consequences of climate change for specific communities? We have the necessary support and, you know, human resource for that. So I think that's just to add another angle to it, something that we could look at.
Thank you. Just keeping an eye on the time, I think this might be just our last question coming up, although there's another one which I can answer very quickly because someone's asked if there's going to be a recording of this made available. So just to say, yes, we will be publishing it on the Cabot Institute YouTube channel, and we will send a link to everybody who's registered to attend to let you know when it's live. But yeah, the final question I think for today says, thank you very much for this presentation. Young people have been so important in climate action. Can I ask, how did the people in the events talk about young people?
You know, it's something that didn't come up very often, not organically anyway, in the meetings that we were observing. I think sometimes when we talked about just transition or like what climate justice means, future generations and younger people were mentioned in terms of being like not at fault, yet having to bear the costs. Some people also brought up the role of young people in making the climate change problem more known about and for getting people to care about it. You know, Greta Thunberg was mentioned by name, but also the school strikes and the kind of discussion around that and the climate movement in Bristol being quite young. Another way young people came up was the idea that if you want to hire young people in Bristol to your company, you better have some green initiatives in place. You better have a place for them to be able to park their bike and take a shower and, you know, ways that they can reduce their emissions at work, like reusable mugs and all that kind of stuff. So there was this sense that Bristol is filled with young people who care about this, and that is pushing innovation forwards. In terms of decision making, I know there are some plans to actually create a board, city board, around young people and future generations, which I volunteered to sit on just because I do some work in terms of justice for future generations. So that's really exciting. We weren't able to observe that because it's not live yet. And also our research ethics focused on 18+ people. So we weren't able to directly engage with people under 18. Alice, anything to add?
No, I think you covered that.
Well, thank you so much, everybody who came today. Such an honor to share our findings with you. We value your presence. And please, if we didn't get to your question, feel free to email me directly. Alix.Dietzel, my name's under me, I know it's hard to spell, at bristol.ac.uk, tweet me, or get in touch with the Cabot Institute as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate the feedback and your participation. And yes, as Alex says, do get in touch with us via email. I'm currently on leave, but I'm actually returning to work at the end of the month. So if you do want to email me directly as well, a.l.venn@exeter.ac.uk. And Alex and the Cabot Institute can also put you in touch with me.
Yeah, and please do get in touch if you want us to come present these findings at any kind of event. We don't charge, and we'd be happy to give you our time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.